Alrighty, y'all. Good afternoon. I know we'll still have some folks trickling in as we go, but thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As I said when you hopped on, please keep your camera off and your microphone muted throughout the call so as not to distract from our speakers today. Also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat. Use the chat function. No need to wait till the end of the presentation. I'll take note of those questions and we will address them at the end. Today we have Lisa Rinaman, your St. John's Riverkeeper, and Jen Lomberk, your Matanzas Riverkeeper, here to talk to us as we're kind of in the last-ditch efforts of our legislative session, coming up on the end of it here. They're going to talk to you about what's gone on so far and what we still have to do before the end of session. I believe that's all for me, and I'll kick it over to Lisa to start us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate your time on this Thursday afternoon, the second to the last day of session. And so you may be asking why we're doing this today. And for two reasons. One, there's some opportunity to celebrate. There's some good things that have made it through the line, and we want to make sure we protect those good decisions made by our legislature, as well as there are some things that haven't quite made it to the end of this session. And so there's some calls to action we're going to have at the end. So really appreciate you tuning in. We look forward to walking through some of the priority legislation from our different perspectives, or our perspectives as water keepers, from our different watersheds, but also a lot of these issues impact all Florida waters. So we're excited to be here with you today and look forward to answering any questions you have at the end. But first, for those of you that may not be familiar with us, we just want to introduce ourselves to you. Jen?
Sure. So before we dive into the substance of our presentation, pun totally intended, I wanted to provide some background about who we are. And so a lot of folks have heard of St. John's Riverkeeper. Hopefully a lot of folks have heard of Matanzas Riverkeeper. And we are part of Waterkeepers Florida, which is the collective of all 15 waterkeeper organizations across the state working to defend and protect the waterways that their communities rely on. And so we each have our own individual watersheds that we work in. We all have our own communities where we advocate to protect our water. But beyond that, we also collaborate on statewide issues, on things like the Florida legislative session. So we all have our own projects and programs, but we put our heads together to try and protect water at the state level because it all trickles down to our watersheds eventually.
And so while we all work collectively, we do have our individual missions that really dovetail into one another. So it's been fantastic to work with our water keepers across the state. At St. John's Riverkeeper, we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to defend the St. John's River and advocate for its protection. And it goes beyond just the main channel of the St. John's. That also includes its springs, its tributaries, as well as its entire watershed, which is over 8,800 square miles, which is about 16% of the state. So fortunately, we have lots of partners, and for us to do this work to protect the St. John's, it depends on citizen advocacy. So we really appreciate your time today and the opportunity to work together to protect the St. John's.
And just a little bit further south, Matanzas Riverkeeper is based in St. Augustine, and our mission is to protect the health of the Guantanamo-Matanzas watershed through advocacy, education, and community engagement. So we like to say that St. John's Riverkeeper is our big sister organization just to the north of us.
Thanks, Jen. All right, well, let's jump right into the legislation. I know that's what y'all all signed up for. I'm here to talk about. And one of the most important pieces of legislation from the St. John's River perspective is Senate Bill 1066 and House Bill 981. This is Tributaries of the St. John's River. And this was historic legislation. It's been fondly called as the Northeast Florida River, Springs, and Community Investment Act. And this bill is the vehicle that would restore the natural flow of the Ocklawaha River, which connects Silver Springs, the largest tributary to the St. John's, to the Ocklawaha and the St. John's River. But this project went beyond just restoration. Restoration of the Ocklawaha in its own right has significant ecological, environmental, as well as economic benefit. By restoring the natural connection, it would provide that natural freshwater flow from the Silver Springs through the spring sheds of the Ocklawaha into the St. John's, which helps regulate the salt freshwater balance of the St. John's River estuary. It would uncover 20 springs that are now drowned out underneath the pool behind the Rodman Dam, restores more than 7,500 acres of forested floodplain, which are the best filters a river can have, as well as provides much needed flood protection for downstream riverfront communities. It provides migratory fish patterns for our historic fish of the Ocklawaha to return. And then it also enhances local recreational amenities. Those benefits have been well known and documented by our state, federal agencies, but this legislation actually took all of this a step forward. Thanks to community leaders in Putnam and Marion counties working with the bill sponsors, Senator Brodeur and Representative Duggan, this not only focused on directing the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to restore the Ocklawaha by 2032. It also created an outdoor recreational advisory committee that had 19 members of all the different counties surrounding the restoration project to ensure that not only restoration benefits were achieved, but there'd be more access to the restored waterway. And it incorporates economic incentives to ensure that the local communities had a boost economically from a small business perspective and outdoor recreation. The great news is on this bill, it passed 107 to 3 in the Florida House. It made it through all the Florida Senates with only committees with only one no vote. The bad news is it has not reached the floor at this point. There's about 12 hours that this could still get on the Senate floor. And so we're asking for all people that are considered and concerned and would like to see this happen to contact Senator Albritton right away and ask this vote to come to the floor. Again, unanimous support across many committees, and so it's time to get to a vote. So we'll have there's a QR code there at the bottom of the screen, and at the end of this presentation, we'll have several calls to action on this and other bills of important note. We'll also answer any questions that you have at that time. Another priority for St. John's Riverkeeper for several years has been to stop the land disposal of Class B biosolids to the headwaters of the St. Johns River. Class B biosolids, which is also known as sewage sludge, is a partially treated byproduct of treating sewage at wastewater treatment facilities. And unfortunately, one of the disposal message of this highly concentrated human waste is to dispose of it on farmland. It is rich in nutrients, and so that makes it ideal in some cases to be used as fertilizer. The problem is it has way too much phosphorus for what our crops need and where this is being permitted to actually be disposed of on farmland. In 2007, this practice was banned in South Florida by the Florida legislature, which unfortunately inadvertently sent about 70,000 tons of this highly concentrated human waste to the headwaters of the St. Johns. The good news this legislative session in Senate Bill 290 and House Bill 433, which is an omnibus bill for the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, it actually bans this disposal practice of Class B biosolids by 2028. There are other provisions in this bill that are not as beneficial for the environment, but we're very pleased to see this important provision in place. On the flip side, though, it will inadvertently lead to the production of more Class AA biosolids, which is better treated, so you don't have as many pathogens, heavy metals, and other contaminants. But the problem with Class AA biosolids, it still has the nutrient pollution issue that will result in high levels of nutrient pollution runoff if not regulated. And so a complementary piece of legislation that we're very excited to see have passed through both the House and the Senate is a biosolids management bill, Senate Bill 1294 by Senator Bradley and House Bill 1245 sponsored by Representative Schoaf. And this actually provides those guardrails to deal with this increase of Class AA production and potential land disposal, and really make sure that there's requirements that the land disposal or use of Class AA biosolids, which again is better treated, it meets what the agricultural needs are. And so it makes sure that there's only allowed to put what the crops need. It prohibits bulk disposal, make sure that they're not just dumping this product because it's a cheap disposal process, but also requires record keeping and giving the Florida Department of Environmental Protection the ability to initiate rulemaking to provide some teeth to those guardrails, and requires U.S. IFAS program to publish what those agronomic rates or what the agricultural needs are that need to be followed. So this, in tandem with the Class B biosolids, is a huge step forward in ensuring Florida has a sustainable program for managing this byproduct of treating our sewage that goes to wastewater treatment facilities. But it'll be something to watch because there is rulemaking. There'll be more opportunity for citizen engagement that we'll be tracking and making sure that we ask you all to help us to ensure that this moves forward seamlessly and in a way that there's no unintended consequences. And just said this bill, these have passed, the 2 biosolids packages have passed, but we want to ensure that they make it over the finish line over the last 24 hours of session, as well as moving forward when they go to the governor's desk. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk about some of the priorities that she's been focusing on.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, and so the first bill that I'm going to talk about is called Conservation Lands. It's House Bill 441 and Senate Bill 546. And this has been a priority for Matanzas Riverkeeper because this bill was born out of the guana land swap debacle that we had to deal with last summer. And so for folks who may not have been plugged into that particular issue, we've got a beautiful natural area in the Guantanamo Matanzas watershed called the Guana Wildlife Management Area. And last year, there was a proposal to essentially give away 600 acres of land within that wildlife management area in exchange for a bunch of scattered parcels around the state. The state was going to swap the ownership of those lands. And so this campaign was hot and heavy. We had to move really fast because there was only 7 days public notice given before this was scheduled to be voted on. And so luckily, Representative Kim Kendall, our local House representative here, she stepped up and became a leader on this issue and was able to assist in the effort to get that proposal withdrawn. But she wanted to make sure that this type of thing never happened again. And so one of the ways that she sought to address this was by filing this bill. And so what this bill does is it expands the notice requirements from just 7 days to 30 days. So we have a lot more time to review these types of applications. And it also increases the transparency in these types of applications. One of the frustrating things about this was that we weren't sure what was going to be conserved, what was going to be developed, who the applicant was. There was just a huge lack of information that made it really difficult to respond to this. And so her bill will require that when these type of applications come forward, they have a lot more of that information, including the areas that are going to be preserved, what's going to be involved in the exchange, and then also an explanation for why that land is no longer needed for conservation purposes. And that's really important because when the state acquires land for conservation, there is the assumption that it's going to stay in conservation. And if the state is getting rid of that land, there needs to be a legitimate reason for why those conservation purposes are no longer valid. And that's something that was already required, but this statute doubles down on that requirement in that language and requires that it be explicitly illustrated in an application. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a bill that we have been opposing during this legislative session. It is called the Blue Ribbon Projects Bill. We have been referring to it as the Developer's Dream Bill. And basically what this bill would do is it would fast track development approvals for large parcels of land, parcels that were 15,000 acres or more. And what it would do is if a landowner owned a Blue Ribbon Projects tract of 15,000 acres or more, they could apply to the local government for a Blue Ribbon Project, making sure that it checks all the boxes for what constitutes a Blue Ribbon Project. And then the local government would be required to approve that project regardless of what their local land development regulations say, regardless of whether it complies with the underlying land use or comprehensive plan, regardless of whether it's outside of their urban development boundaries. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that it takes planning authority away from local governments. Local governments are generally pretty thoughtful about where development should and shouldn't happen. And this throws all of that out the window. This is also problematic because when you think about where a landowner might own 15,000 acres of land, those areas are generally going to be in rural parts of our community, in areas where agriculture is fairly common. And those parts of the community generally are far away from infrastructure. And so in order for a community to support this type of development, they have to build new roads, new sewer lines, new water lines, new fire stations, all of the infrastructure to support this kind of development, which could be a huge financial burden on a community if a massive development is being plopped down somewhere that they weren't planning for it. One of the main issues that we have with this bill is that a lot of the folks supporting it are kind of lauding it as a conservation win, because the bill does require that 60% of the land is reserve land. But in the debate around this bill, a lot of people have been conflating the word reserve with words like conserve and preserve. And those words all have very different meanings. There is no requirement for 60% of the land to be conserved like we think of. And in fact, the definition for reserve is incredibly broad and would allow things like stormwater treatment ponds and utility infrastructure, lift stations, power substations, pickleball courts, things like that. And so we didn't feel that this bill did a very good job of actually conserving enough land to make the trade-off worth it. And so in addition to that, removing community voices from the conversation and fast-tracking development approval for massive tracts of land, that's been something that we're really concerned about. And so at this point, this bill is on the Senate calendar and can be brought up literally at any moment. The Senate convenes at 1 p.m., so right after this meeting. And so we're really encouraging folks to go ahead, click that link, scan that QR code, and send an email to your legislators telling them that we do not support the Blue Ribbon Project's bill. Next slide, Lisa. All right, and so House Bill 217/Senate Bill 840. This one's a little bit more convoluted, so join me on this journey if you would. So every local government in the state of Florida has a comprehensive plan, and that's like the constitution of that local government. It dictates where development's going to happen, how development's going to happen, what the vision is for a community. And local governments are required to periodically update their comprehensive plans. And right here in St. Johns County, our county actually spent over $500,000 on a consultant who gathered input from our community through listening sessions and town halls and online surveys, and took all of that community feedback and drafted an update to our comprehensive plan that we felt did a pretty good job of capturing that feedback. And then that comprehensive plan was transmitted to the state last year. Unfortunately, during last year's legislative session, there was a last-minute amendment to Senate Bill 180. And what that did was it prohibited local governments from adopting comprehensive plan amendments that are deemed more restrictive or burdensome than what is currently on the books. And so because of that incredibly broad language, St. Johns County's comprehensive plan got rejected and sent back. And so the county had to remove all of that community feedback. And so that included things like protections for bicycle safety, protections for hurricane evacuation routes, protections for environmentally sensitive land, rural agricultural areas, air quality, water quality, all of the things that our community felt were important and should be protected through a comprehensive plan got removed because of this last minute amendment to Senate Bill 180 from last year. And so this year, the legislature, Senator Nick DeSigley filed Senate Bill 840, which was aimed to fix a lot of the problems that Senate Bill 180 caused. And Senate Bill 840 cruised through its committee stops. Unfortunately, the House companion to that bill didn't move. And so we are in the 11th hour of the session at this point, and we are trying to get a fix for Senate Bill 180 passed before the legislative session ends. And so at this point, we are supporting an amendment to another bill, House Bill 399, to try and get some of that good language from Senate Bill 840 amended onto House Bill 399. So again, I encourage you to scan that QR code, reach out to our legislators. The time is nigh. Like I said, the Senate reconvenes at 1 p.m. this afternoon, so the clock is ticking down. Next slide, Lisa. All right, and then the last bill that I wanted to talk about is the PFAS bill. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with PFAS, PFAS is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, commonly known as forever chemicals. And they're characterized by a really strong fluorine-carbon bond. And the strength of the bond that makes these chemicals incredibly resistant to degradation makes them very useful in product applications, but makes them extremely challenging to deal with once they get into the environment. And more scientific studies are showing that exposure to PFAS is linked to harmful health effects in humans, including hormone disruption, developmental delay in children, and increased risk of some cancers. And so we're really concerned about the prevalence of PFAS, and trying to figure out how to wrap our arms around how to deal with it once it gets into our environment. And one common product that contains high levels of PFAS is aqueous film forming foam or firefighting foam. And so what this bill does is that it limits the use of firefighting foam for many types of applications where there are other alternatives that exist. But the component of this bill that we are possibly more excited about is a provision that will require most wastewater treatment facilities to conduct quarterly PFAS testing of their sewage sludge and of their effluent. Studies are showing that PFAS will pass through the human body. They tend to accumulate in sewage sludge. So when that sludge is land applied, like Lisa was talking about, it's a very common method of disposal. Those PFAS can leach out of the sewage sludge into nearby waterways. And at this point, we're still trying to identify sources of where PFAS is coming from. We're still trying to figure out how much of it is in the environment. And so even this first initial step towards testing is a step in the right direction to help us get a better hold on how we can better prevent PFAS pollution in our waterways.
And Jen, if I could just add to that too, because we are celebrating this legislation as well, because biosolids is a known PFAS source, and a lot of people don't realize that at our wastewater treatment facilities, sometimes there's industrial waste that's commingled into our industrial wastewater treatment facilities. Some of them accept leachate from our landfills. And so there's multiple PFAS sources that are going to our wastewater treatment facility and then getting basically applied on land. And that's one of our theories of why the Department of Agriculture is moving forward on that Class B ban, because not only is it being applied on this ranch land, it's contaminating land potentially. It's getting through the food chain and getting into beef. There's actually a case in Texas where ranchers had to basically euthanize their cattle because there was so much PFAS in the meat, and they're suing EPA. So this is another, important step to making sure that our land is protected, the food we eat is protected, as well as our waterways. All right, so we wanted to make it very easy for you all to take action today. As you can see, as you heard, time is of the essence. This is the final day and a half of session. The Senate is where a lot of these actions can take place. So all of these calls to actions here are to senators. And so we want to make it available for you. And also, we wanted to see if you all had any questions regarding any of the bills that we talked about today, or other things that are on your mind. And we'll let Dryden monitor the chat if you have questions.
Thanks, Lisa and Jen. I'm putting in the chat right now the links for these calls to action as well if you have any trouble with the QR code. That is somewhere that you can also do that. And I'm keeping an eye on the chat. But one question that we had, kind of like, what's the procedure? What's next after today? I know we're in like the crunch time. Tomorrow's the last official day of session. What happens after that? Like, what different scenarios are there?
Jen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure thing. So that will depend on what happens with the bill. So a bill has to be reconciled by both chambers of the legislature, which means the House and the Senate have to agree on the same language for a bill. And then at that point, the bill is enrolled, which means that it's ready to be sent to the governor's desk. Once it's sent to the governor's desk, the governor can choose to sign it, or he can choose to veto it, which means that the advocacy is not over just because the legislature wraps up for the year. So continue to stay tuned for more action alerts.
Thanks, Jen. Another question. Will any dead bills this year come back next year? Like, if something doesn't go through this year, are we going to try again? What does that look like?
Sure. And I would just add there's two scenarios, because there will be a special session, and in some versions of the special session, they could take up bills that have still not had final action, but that's all dependent on leadership and what they determine the special session this year will address with. And absolutely, I think, if for those of you out there who have been following legislative sessions as well as, or maybe new to the process, it typically takes several times for good and bad bills to get through the legislative session. What we hope the public process will create are working together to have better legislation each year, learning from wins or losses in during the legislative session. So I know that we will continue to see some of the bills that didn't pass, both what we think are environmentally friendly and things we need to protect and restore our waterways will come back. But we also have to be very diligent during throughout the year to make sure that we're watching other types of threats. The legislative session, a lot happens even in the last few hours of the session, but also a lot of the work is done in the summer, in the fall, when our legislators are in their districts are some of the best times to meet with them on issues that are important in our local areas or to statewide. And so I know we're all talking about, what's next after this session, moving into getting ready and getting prepared and ensuring that we are able to give our waters a voice very early, planning up to next year's session.
Yeah, one other thing I want to add to that is the only bill that the legislature is constitutionally required to pass is the budget, and they are not going to have the budget done by the time the session is scheduled to end this Friday. And so that's going to have to run long. And so something that we need to be very diligent about is sometimes, very often, they will try and sneak policy changes into budget implementing bill languages. So if something did not make it through in the normal course of the legislative session, there is still an opportunity for it to get amended into the budget. So that's something that we definitely need to keep an eye out for.
And just to add to the importance of all of us working together, there are more steps to come. One of the challenges in the budget right now is Florida Forever, which is our conservation land purchasing arm. That's funding is absent in one version of the budget, and it's very low. And those are dollars that are basically paid with dock stamps. So it's designed to offset development. And it was in 2000, gosh, was it 2014, when there was a unanimous vote that Floridians wanted to make sure these dollars were dedicated to purchasing conservation land to offset growth. It was dedicated to this. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that come to fruition in these early drafts of the budget. So look forward for more calls to action on that and potentially other budget items as they move forward with that special session.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Lisa, protecting land is one of the best ways to protect water. Some people ask, like, well, if you guys are water keepers, then why are you working on land conservation issues? It is because we need those upland buffers. We need those wetland migration corridors. Protecting land protects water. And Florida Forever, historically, if you look back over 10 years ago, it was pretty consistently funded at a level of $300 million a year. And then about 10 years or so, that funding started to decline until it was eventually unfunded. And so this year, like Lisa said, the House version of the budget doesn't allocate any money for it at all. And the Senate version only allocates 35 million with a limitation that that money can only be used to buy agricultural easements. So not what you think of when you think of conservation land. It's not like a state park. And it's also not nearly enough money to fund the scale of land conservation that we need. Florida has, through the Florida Forever program, earmarked where the high priorities for land conservation are across the state. And by its own internal calculation, if we keep funding land conservation at the rate that we have been funding it, it'll take well over 200 years for us to acquire all of the priority properties for conservation. I don't need to tell anybody on this call that there's not going to be a whole lot of Florida left unpaved in 200 years if we don't start making a concerted effort to buy more land for conservation.
Thanks, Lisa and Jen. Another question that we've got focusing on a specific piece of legislation, as far as Senate Bill 1066, the Tributaries, the Ocklawaha bill. What does the appropriations process and funding look like for this, like in the bill and then also in light of a potential budget shortfall?
Sure, and the appropriations attached to the bill is part of the budget discussion, and so that is something that has not come to fruition yet. And depending on what happens with this bill in the next 24 hours, that'll be another discussion within the next session, the next special session to discuss the budget. But it was anticipated looking at upwards of $100 million for those economic incentives. To cost the restoration piece of it is approximately $70 million. Those dollars for the restoration could come from already appropriated funds. One, Florida Forever would be appropriate funds to do that restoration, or the Springs restoration allocation dollars, because it is the largest springs restoration project in the state.
Great. Thank you. And then focusing on another piece of legislation, the PFAS bills we were talking about, HB 109 and SB 1230. Kind of what is the status of those? Have they passed through either the House or the Senate, committees, whatnot? Where are we with that one?
Yeah, so those ones had pretty smooth sailing. So at this point, those bills have passed both chambers of the legislature and have been enrolled. So those are headed to the governor's desk.
Awesome. And then kind of just piggybacking off of that for those of us who aren't as aware of the PFAS issue, like why is PFAS so bad? Why are they called forever chemicals? Like why do we not want them? Why are we so concerned about them?
Yeah, I mean, circling back to what I was saying, one of the things that makes PFAS so challenging is their persistence, the fact that they do not break down. That's why they are called forever chemicals. Once they exist in a river or in your body, it's incredibly hard to get rid of them. And more science is showing that PFAS have a lot of different human health impacts, whether it's increased cancer risk, whether it is hormone disruption. And one of the things that's challenging about dealing with PFAS, in addition to their persistence, is the fact that there are thousands of different kinds of PFAS. And so trying to regulate a chemical that has so many different variations can be incredibly challenging. And so the first step is really just trying to wrap our arms around collecting the data, seeing where these sources are before we can even get to setting standards for them and figuring out how to prevent and remove them from our ecosystems.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I do want to give people just another minute. If you have any additional questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat now. We do have a little bit more time that we can use. But while people are still thinking about more questions, I know, Lisa, you talked about it a little bit, but kind of like what are we doing in the meantime? If session's about to be over, what are we working on? What are we hopeful for? What's going on after this?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dryden. I mean, it's we have to, remain active to one, even when there's good legislation passed, like some of the ones we're looking to celebrate soon, as well when they get signed by the governor. There's steps that have to be taken. Like for the Class AA biosolids management, there's rulemaking. There's standards that have to be written. There's definitions that have to be in place, and so there's a really important citizen activity that we need to make sure we're providing oversight and we're engaging and participating. For some of this legislation that falls short, we need to be out there having the conversations about why it's important, learning from things that happen this legislative session to ensure that we're building momentum on the positive, the steps forward, but making sure that we're continuing to give our rivers a voice. What it may be better monitoring in some cases. We're looking, I know, on the PFAS side to really understand the quarterly sampling, how that's going to be done, where that information's available. Also doing some of our own sampling, working with citizens, especially in the upper basin of the St. Johns River, where biosolids has been such a problem, and we're seeing significant issues with nutrient pollution, better understanding some of the facts and some of what the river's telling us with good data from those areas. So I think it's, we need around the clock, year round, we have to be building our cases for why these improvements from a policy and regulatory perspective are important. Having the conversations with local elected leaders, as well as citizens throughout our watersheds, throughout the state, and making sure that we're working towards having that important conversation with our elected officials. So we build on the momentum or also backtrack and try to pick up the pieces of where we may have fallen short and make sure that we're ready for 2027.
Yeah, and beyond that, the work doesn't stop with us, right? The
Right.
elected officials are used to hearing from us, from hearing from environmental advocates, from hearing from water keepers. And so that's where you all on the call come in. They need to know that their constituents care about these issues. They need to know that votes will be cast depending on these issues. And so staying involved, have knowing who your representatives are, visiting these places, enjoying these places, highlighting these places. Those are all things that can be done during the off season that kind of put us in a better position for success during the legislative session. Whether that is reaching out to your legislators and thanking them for a good vote, or posting social media content about your visit to a spring or to a state park and tagging your representatives in that, just reminding them that these are things that are important to their constituents is hugely helpful to the work that we do.
Thank y'all so much. If we want to go to the next slide, I've got some opportunities for y'all to stay involved after a legislative session, some different opportunities to learn more about what's going on, be better stewards of our watersheds, and also just to get out there and explore them. So in addition to the volunteer events that we have going on throughout the year, like cleanups, some of our upcoming events include our Rising Tides Climate Chat Happy Hour. So Rising Tides is our young professionals group. And they will be meeting at Grace Note Brewing here in Jacksonville on March 24th. It's going to be a casual happy hour, and we're going to have an open dialogue about climate change and the river. There'll be some nice conversation cards to guide you, but basically just to keep us informed, keep us talking about it, having an open dialogue. It's really like the first step in getting things done. So I'm going to be doing that. We're having a happy hour meetup in the Headwaters at Helen Blazes Brewing in Melbourne on March 26th, where you can come meet our new Headwaters specialist and meet with some St. John's Riverkeeper folks in the Upper Basin. And then we're partnering with Matanzas Riverkeeper and St. Johns County Parks for River Reflection, which is an annual event that happens at Alpine Groves Parks in St. Johns County on March 27th. It's kind of an open air art gallery. It's local artists are presenting their work and showcasing the connection of the water and community. And we'll both be there tabling as well. So that's a good opportunity to come see us and get to know us. And then finally, on April 4th, we're hosting an art and nature walk at Blue Cypress Park here in Jacksonville. It's going to be really fun, low key, good, relaxing kind of slow nature walk where we stop a couple of times where you can do some nature journaling or really any sort of kind of creative endeavor that you want to do where you really stop and observe nature. And it's a great way to appreciate the St. Johns River and the watershed. So you can go to stjohnsriverkeeper.org/events. I'm going to drop that in the chat to see all of those upcoming events, our volunteer events as well, and to register for those events.
And then I just wanted to thank you all for coming and joining us today. We did put all of our contact information on the screen here. If you have any questions for me or Jen, please stay in touch. If you want to think of ideas or want to engage more with any of our organizations, please let us know. And just really thank you for your time and for caring about Florida waters and joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. And if you've already done one of our calls to action today, go ahead and put it in the chat. Say, done, I did it. And we'll give you a little round of applause. Thank y'all so much.